Good evening, everyone. I'm calling to order the Wednesday, June 13th, 2018 meeting of the Evanston Plan Commission. Can we have a roll call for?
Sure. All right. Commissioner Brown? Here. Commissioner Dubin?
Here.
Commissioner Goddard?
Here.
Commissioner Halleck? Commissioner Isaac? Commissioner Pagotzi? And Chair Lewis?
Here. So I believe that there are 7 members officially now of the Plan Commission and 4 attending, so we do have a quorum.
Yes.
So I should ask the audience that if you're going to speak tonight, I'm going to have to ask you to sign the form if you have signed it. And when you come to speak, can you please come to the podium and speak into the microphone for recording purposes? And I would like to now swear in anyone who is going to speak. Do you promise to tell the truth?
Yes.
Good, thank you. All right, so the first order of business is we have two minutes to approve. The first is of the meeting of April 11th, 2018. Are there any comments, revisions? Will anyone make a motion?
So moved.
So move to what?
Approve the minutes. Sorry.
Thank you. Second? Okay. Voice vote, I think, is fine. All in favor? Aye. All against? All right. The second is the meeting of April 18th, 2018. Are there any amendments, modifications to the minutes?
Yes. On page 4, I just want to make clear that we were not objecting to the installation of the pay boxes or the countdown timers, merely asking the developer to pay for them. And thanks, Megan.
Duly noted.
All right. So, any other corrections, amendments? All right. So, is there a motion?
Move to approve the minutes.
Minutes as they are, or as
Oh, as
amended?
corrected.
Okay. Thank you. Second?
Second.
Okay. All in favor? Aye. All against? Okay. The minutes are approved. So, I think I can dispense with the general proceedings, other than to say quickly we are an advisory commission that will give any motions that we have here our recommendations to the City Council for final approval. The general format that we're going to go through is to have staff make a presentation of the 2 text amendments that are on. First, there is an old business text amendment for front porches, and second will be a new business text amendment for revisions to the Preservation Commission review procedures. After we'll go one by one through those. After the presentation, we'll open the floor up for questions. We'll first do the audience, and then I think we'll let commissioners ask questions. And then we'll open it up to the public for statements. And then we can have the commissioners, we'll close the public hearing and then have the commissioners do their deliberations. So can I ask, have I missed anything? No? Anyone? Good enough? All right. Who is going to give the presentation?
Yes, I will. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, members of the public. So this first item this evening is a zoning ordinance text amendment regarding porch regulations. If you recall, this item was before the commission back in October. Just a little bit of background. This was a staff-initiated text amendment where we're seeing a reasonable volume of front porch variation requests and finding that our current code regulations allow for a 10% projection into the required front yard setback for a number of different types of projections. Such as chimneys and bay windows, were not sufficient for front porches, that the dimensions and depth of front porches are larger than some of those other items within that 10% setback, and suggested some changes to that ordinance to make it a little more user-friendly for both applicants. They're looking to add front porches, generally enlivening the street frontage and enhancing the front of the building, as well as staff. If there are items that are being routinely approved as variations, we look to look at those rules and regulations and see if some of those should be allowed by right. So that was kind of the genesis for it. So on this slide, we have the existing definition of a porch, which includes both an open or enclosed area on the building, between the front of the building and the right-of-way. And then, as mentioned, the current ordinance allows for that 10% setback. So in February, the staff presented a couple options to the Plan Commission. The Plan Commission made a recommendation that front porches should maintain a minimum 10-foot front yard setback from the property line. And that the allowed porch depth may be the greater of 6 feet or 25% of the depth of the required front yard. This recommendation was presented to the Planning and Development Committee of the City Council. There was discussion and input from the public, including from the current and former chairs of the Zoning Board of Appeals regarding the proposal. And that memo is included in your packet. To some, there were some concerns about the proposed recommendation being maybe too lenient or too allowing front porches more than could be prudent in some people's opinion. So eventually this was referred back to the Plan Commission for more discussion. But there was a memo by the current and former ZBA chair. So that amendment is summarized here as proposed, that front porches should maintain that minimum 10-foot front yard setback, which is the same as the Plan Commission recommendation. That front porches may encroach up to 25% into the depth of the required front yard and shall not exceed a maximum porch depth of 7 feet. So establishing a maximum instead of a minimum there being a notable difference. And that enclosed porches are prohibited encroachments into the front yard. So enclosed porches would have to follow the regular setbacks of a principal structure and not be allowed to encroach into that. And then any request for a porch depth beyond the 25% encroachment into the required front yard would require a major variation for zoning relief rather than a minor variation. And the difference there, the major variation is before the Zoning Board of Appeals, where a minor variation is decided by the zoning administrator with notice and input on that, and then could be appealed to the ZBA. So staff has taken a look at this and is suggesting an adjustment to the ZBA chair's amendment to create a separate definition for enclosed and open porches, and to allow enclosed porches, which would be less than 50% open, to follow that 10% encroachment regulations as currently allowed, while allowing open porches, those of more than 50% open, to follow the new regulations that would be more permissive as far as the 25% encroachment that could be allowed by right. And so this adjustment addresses some staff concerns about creating a large number of non-conforming enclosed porches that would have followed the current regulations and previous regulations, but would be made non-conforming. So by creating these two definitions and two sets of regulations, although maybe not simplifying things as much as we had originally intended, would establish that those non-conforming enclosed porches would be conforming. So this table tries to summarize a comparison of the options. And again, we selected a variety of setbacks, with 27 feet being the required setback in most instances, or many instances. However, the average setback of adjacent properties and or on the block determining the required setback in other instances. So there's a range of those, from 50 feet of a required setback down to 12, and then showing what would be allowed under both scenarios. So the first blue column there would be the resulting required porch setback under the Plan Commission's recommendation. And again, seeing that ranging from 37.5 feet down to 10 feet. And then the last column being the resulting required porch setback under the ZBA chair's proposal, and that ranging from 43 feet down to 10 feet. So you can notice that some of the areas where those would differ, mostly in areas where you have a smaller required setback. So that would be a situation where there's an average setback on that block of homes that are already closer to the street than that 27 feet typical required setback. We also developed one visual to show just a little bit of a comparison in what a porch depth would look like using SketchUp, 3.75 foot porch, which would be assuming a front yard setback of 15 feet with the 25% encroachment that could be allowed there under the ZBA option, and then a 6-foot front porch that would be allowed using the Plan Commission recommendation there. So it's a little bit of a visualization of those. So with that, we do have the standards of amendments, and we can go on to those later, but those are on the screen for you to be consistent generally with the comprehensive plan, to be compatible with the character of existing development, to not have an adverse effect on the value of adjacent properties, and that there's adequacy of public facilities and services. So that summarizes the proposed recommendations out there. I know there are several here, so we're open to discussion and questions. Thank you.
Mr. Mango, thank you very much. It's very clear. So at this moment, I think I'd like to open it up to questions. Do you have any questions of the? Okay. Do we have questions? Any one of the commissioners have questions? So I guess I do. The issue of non-conforming structures, which is primary concern to administration, is that emphasized or more prevalent with the Plan Commission's or the zoning board's proposals for the zoning chair's proposals for which one exacerbates the issue more?
The ZBA chairs would without a modification to set different requirements for enclosed and unenclosed porches would be the concern there.
Okay. I also guess I'm a little confused at what makes the difference between a closed porch and just an addition to the front of a building. So what's the definition of a closed porch in relationship to that?
Right now, we just have one definition for a porch, and it can be either open or enclosed. So it probably is up to some interpretation whether it's a porch enclosed, fully enclosed porch, or a building addition. The proposed language of creating two different definitions would be to differentiate between the two more clearly, setting a opacity level, and that language could be tweaked as well to be open air or something of that nature of a certain limit. If there's an open porch, which are probably the majority that we see proposed, I know one of the concerns expressed was that sometimes porches get enclosed without the city's knowledge or without the benefit of a permit, and that if there was a porch that was more than 50% open, that would be more difficult to enclose without knowledge of the city.
All right, and so there are certain other regulations that affect the porches, the difference between enclosed and open, including the lot coverage regulation. Is that true? So
Do allow for a credit for porches, essentially, to account 50% of the porch if it meets certain criteria towards building lot coverage and impervious surface as a bonus or a credit towards those calculations.
any other questions? Yeah.
I'm just going back to the chart, 4 columns. I'm not sure which one is being considered. Is it the third column?
So on the screen, on the visual and the PowerPoint presentation, the kind of two options are presented of the Plan Commission recommended option back from February, and then the Zoning Board Chair's option. So the third and fourth column here are the Plan Commission recommendation, and then the final two columns, the fourth and fifth column, are the ZBA Chair's recommendation.
So if I can interject, I think Commissioner Pagotzi, we have two propositions: what our recommendation or the former and current zoning board chair's recommendation to consider. We could do a combination of either, some other permutation, or we could actually decide that the regulation as stands would be our recommendation. So I think there are more than the two columns to consider. So,
Good point.
Okay.
okay.
I mean, I asked why 7 was the ceiling.
Why don't we just get a little informal here? Yeah. Yeah.
You probably can't hear me is the problem. So
Yeah.
that's
No,
the
we
problem.
can hear you,
You can
but
hear
the recording, I think,
recording
is the issue.
mechanism
Yeah,
would not
yeah.
be able to hear. My name's Matt Rogers, former zoning board chair, and yeah, we might as well. If you don't mind, we'll play a little informally here. so
Sure,
we can have a
that's
conversation.
perfectly fine. I mean, we're all-
It might make it easier.
I
than
felt a
trying
little
to-
silly, going through the procedure.
Right, it might be a little easier than us having kind of a
Thank you.
getting up and down and that sort of stuff when questions arise. So Mary Beth Burns, who's handing out things, is the current zoning board chair. What we did is I wanted to be at the last meeting at which this was addressed, but unfortunately I was at a Design Evanston meeting where they were talking about Northlight, which ended up going nowhere. So I could have come to this meeting instead. But one of the things we wanted to look at is kind of using our experience on the types of porches that we see, things that we regularly would see coming through the zoning board, and figure out how we could allow residents to have a sufficient enough porch. As was mentioned, having a 10% allowance for a 27-foot lot gives you a 2.7-foot depth porch. Well, when you open your front door swings out further than your porch is allowed to be, which seemed a little unusual. And we also wanted to work at trying to make it a little easier for people to be able to go through the process by getting something by right that was a usable depth without having to go through the process of filing for ZBA hearings, getting staff involved, and taking things through the whole process. If there were things that could be done right up front through a permit desk, through a simple process, it'd be much easier to do that. So basically what we did was we kind of looked at the options that were available, and the one thing that we sort of felt we wanted to address is the first page that was handed out, which sort of talks about the slowing the encroachment of porches. By tying it to a 25% number, to a percentage of the lot instead of a set depth, when we get into smaller lots, we actually prevent the porch from encroaching more quickly towards that 10-foot minimum setback that we both have agreed upon. So the idea was that in places where the average of the homes is being taken across the front, those porches would not move as quickly into that front yard. We agree, like I said, with the 10% front yard minimum setback. We proposed a 25% depth of the required front yard, and we chose 7 feet because we felt that was a usable space. Again, anybody can request anything from the zoning board, and the zoning board can grant just about anything. The idea was to make people think about their decisions and to make people say, we're giving you something that's very generous, much more generous than has been granted by the city in the past. If you want an 8-foot porch, if you want a 10-foot porch, that's something that could be granted if your zoning district and your particular block would allow it without it feeling that it's an imposition upon the neighbors. So that's why 7 feet was chosen. It was a random number.
Can I interject something else about the 7 feet? So the other thing we see all the time is that these porches got enclosed. Not necessarily by the owner who's now here applying for a variance, but by somebody else without a permit. And so now it's suddenly magically interior space. And so the 7 feet really limits you to what you can turn that into if you're gonna surreptitiously do something. So that's sort of one of the other goals of that 7 feet. I think we also looked at some of our neighboring communities, right? Wilmette, Skokie, Kenilworth, all those sorts of communities, and they will limit their maximum encroachment to 7 feet as well. So it seemed like we're keeping up with the Joneses, and we're keeping it so that it's not as attractive to enclose the space without a permit. So that's where the 7 sort of, there's a bunch of reasons.
That's good to know, because that's very different than Mr. Rogers said.
Yeah,
So it is the precedent.
in adjacent communities, yes.
So in the memo that we provided, Mr. Chairman, there actually is a list of Wilmette, Oak Park, Lincolnwood, Chicago, and Skokie, and what they allow based on open porches that are roofed, open porches that are not roofed, and awning and canopies. The thing is that none of those communities permit an enclosed porch. So that's why that portion was not figured into those equations.
That was one of the issues that I had, because an enclosed porch is a room, and I think should be within the setback as myself.
Well, and
But,
as you move, I see everybody's been looking ahead into their little packet of papers. So that was one of the other goals that we looked about, was trying to prevent homes from, again, not necessarily current homeowner doing it. Someone gets a front porch, an enclosed front porch, added onto the front of their house. 20 years down the road, somehow that porch has magically been enclosed. Mm-hmm. And then that person who's bought that house, maybe 2 or 3 owners later, says, I don't have a front porch. I need a front porch. And they come and ask for a front porch in front of what used to be a front porch, which just, again, increases that encroachment into yards. And on the second page of our documents that we handed out, you can sort of see, and this is just a purely made-up street. I put numbers on them, so if anybody wanted to reference them, this is not actually the 2300 block of any particular street in town. And looking at the top row, sort of looking at the 27 feet being what is the setback there. And again, porches are not considered part of the setback. Mm-hmm. So that's why they are in a lighter color above. Very rarely would you have a block where everything perfectly lines up at 27 feet, but I did this just for the sake of making it easy to see. If you look down into the lower grouping, you can see that 2 of those porches have been converted into living space. 2 of the enclosed porches, the one at 2321 and 2303. And one of those we considered a tear down because that happens all the time where somebody tears down. But that one extra porch sort of starts to allow those homes, those porches to increase and encroach on that block. The other one at 2303, they converted their porch to an enclosed space and are now asking for the porch that they are allowed by the 25%, which is another almost 6.5 feet, 6.25 feet, which, as you see, projects it way further into the front yards than any of the neighboring homes. They actually are at about a 42% encroachment into that yard.
So couldn't we fix that by saying that the allowable depth is beyond the required setback, or just language that's that way? I mean, you're saying that this is from a moving datum, which is the front of the house. So, but if the datum is fixed at the required setback, then...
But that, you can't really set that because the ordinance is written in such a way that it's the average of the homes across the front. So if one home is at 20, one's at 22, one's at 21, my math's not good, that's 20, I think that's 21 would be the average setback there. So the house that's 20 into the front yard actually is set a little further forward than anything else that would be built new along there, because they would look at all of that number of all the homes along that block. And kind of looking at, just to finish up going through my documents real quick and then we can talk again. We found some homes, these are not homes that have any particular meaning to anybody or anything. I did Zillow searches so I could find homes that had pictures and floor plans with them, and sort of showed how you can see how some of these spaces can be easily converted by homeowners over time and how much of a gain that is in terms of their home size and what that can potentially do to bringing the houses forward on the street. So, like I said, these 5 homes have no proposals pending that I'm aware of. Probably would never ask for this, but they were houses that we could find that had enclosed front porches that we wanted to show how in some cases it doesn't matter that much because the house actually comes as far forward as the front of the porch, which is very different than a porch that sits in front of the entire house. Are there any questions on anything at this point? The other thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to make it a major variation request instead of a minor variation request. Again, because the new standard would be much more generous in giving people something by right. Again, anybody can ask for anything. You can ask for a 0-foot front lawn if you want. It will not get passed, but you can ask for it. You can do that as well. So what we wanted to do was to make it less attractive to people to just randomly choose sizes that are larger than they would be permitted, without having to go through the process of going to the Zoning Board of Appeals and proving there is a hardship, that their property is unique in some way, as opposed to we just would like to have a larger front porch.
So, question, huh? So how many porch applications would you usually see in a year, or it's just frequency?
Right now, it sort of depends because the way staff has been handling some of these, staff can approve, and I forget the numbers, at 35%, Scott? 35% of an encroachment into the front yard, they can approve administratively, as opposed to having to bring it to the zoning board. So I don't know the exact number that's coming through that way versus what's coming through on ZBA. I've not been on ZBA for 2 years. I mean, I would say that we used to probably see 5 to 7 a year.
Okay.
Does that sound about right?
Yeah, so I think we haven't seen any recently because of that because of staff giving administrative approval. And so people sort of stop at that. But again, so rather than even having to take up staff's time with those administrative approvals, give people the 25% and then ask them if you really want that extra 10%, come before us and make a case for the 7 standards, right? Tell me what your actual hardship is. Tell me how you can't make a 7-foot porch work for you. And when you're confronted with that, having to actually convince 7 people that I really need that extra foot, might not be so important. And then we get to keep things where they are. And I will tell you this from my own experience is in my frustration with porches, which has been for 8 years now, or 9 years that I've been on the board, is that I really see it sort of as a surreptitious land grab. It's a way to get more lot coverage without there actually being the lot coverage calcs, because you can just enclose it later and nobody's paying attention.
One question, this sort of addressed this the last time this came up, and I asked for the definition of what a porch was. But is this a real problem in this staff seeing a lot of people using it?
I think it's probably tough to answer. Because we don't know all the ones that happen. I just, in passing around town and all that, I don't know that there's a ton of it happening. But again, on a snapshot basis, it's kind of tough to guess. And again, I've been paying more attention to this since February or so when we started bringing it up. There certainly are a lot of blocks and houses where there are first floor protrusions that are enclosed. Sometimes on a block, almost all of them are enclosed. So I think it's kind of clear that they were all enclosed as part of it. There are others that probably have been enclosed over time. I've not seen many instances. I think only one I can think of where it's obviously an enclosed porch and then a porch in front of that porch. But I did see one the other day on Dodge, I think it was. So.
I think that's part of the reason to address that question is why Matt came up with those plans of things that are on the market right now. Because you can see that an enclosed porch as interior living space is fairly common in Evanston. It is a fairly common occurrence. And so we know that those didn't happen with permits because they wouldn't be allowed,
Yeah.
which is what we're trying to nip in the
Right.
bud.
Right, so I think one of the concerns that we also had when we were deliberating was more not necessarily the community rights, but the individual rights that you should be able, if you had a need to have a larger one or were on a big setback or something, to have a larger setback. So that's why we were allowing the larger amount. But I think your point about coming before the zoning board and requesting that doesn't mean we're denying the individual
And I will
rights.
say
So
from our experience, we do definitely take lot size into consideration when people are coming before us for a variance.
Yeah.
It's a very different thing to
Yeah.
put a porch on a half-acre lot than it is to put a porch on a 10th-acre lot.
Yeah.
And so we certainly take that into account, and we have pretty, as a matter of course.
The other thing, Alderman Sufferton brought up a similar point at P&D, sort of about concerns about everybody on the street having their rights. So what I would direct you to is on the second page of our document. If you look what happens to 2305 on my fictitious street that has a 4-foot open front porch, and if you look at how they have lost their sight lines to the right by the house that has encroached. So we all know zoning is that game of property rights for everybody. You can do things on your property, but they have to take into account at some level the properties around them. That's what zoning does. So that was one of the other reasons that we wanted to look at that. And again, anybody can come before zoning board and make their case. And if they have a strong case, it gets approved. That's something that's very easy to do.
yeah, so when we get down to some of the narrower setback requirements, the setback distances that we're arguing about don't seem to be all that great, 10 to, a couple of feet, a foot and a half, when you look at it that way. But when you look at it from the interior porch dimension, it's a much bigger percentage, right?
Right.
So the difference between, for a 14-foot yard, for a 16-foot yard, between a 4-foot porch and a 6-foot porch, I think is significant, in a way. I'm just wondering if that we're pushing, that the difference between getting a usable difference is on the narrower setbacks, and I'm not sure, but is that pushing the hardship to come before the zoning board? It takes time and effort and skill down to people who maybe are in less expensive. I don't know if there's a correlation between front yard setback, but yeah, obviously the big setbacks, people can afford it, right? So
I mean, the bigger setbacks tend to be on larger properties, which are
and
more
so
expensive.
right, exactly. So the smaller ones, I'm wondering if it's putting a little bit, possibly, on a hardship on the
But the other
people
thing-
less likely to be able to
I
afford
think
it.
one of the things we like to consider is on those smaller lots, they're generally a smaller house, and so trying to keep the porch proportional to the house as well, right? You kind of don't want that suburban phenomenon of a garage wagging a house. You kind of don't want the porch to be wagging the house either. And so for us, it seems like that's a reasonable accommodation to get you that front porch while still keeping enough community space by you having that larger setback.
And really where we see the greatest change is around the 15-foot mark. If you look at our little layout, it's a little easier to see because it's graphic.
Which layout, the
On
number two page?
On A,
On
the
A,
first
okay.
page.
Okay, A.
You can see how at 27, 24 feet, we're exactly the same
Yeah,
level.
yeah.
It's when you start to get a little bit smaller. The 16-foot is where you see the greatest difference between the two. And the 14-foot is, again, you suddenly close that gap back in because of that 10-foot front yard
Right.
minimum setback.
I guess the other thing I'd like to say is that, if you look at usable square footage from a front porch perspective, right? If you look at any balconies or any things like that in the city, or even here in Evanston, 4 foot is, although not gracious and generous, is enough to be able to get a couple chairs out there and a table. It's a reasonable size. We're not suggesting that anybody can't do that. We want people out on the porch. We want eyes on the street. We want engagement. We want you to talk to your community. We want you to talk to your neighbors. We want you to do all that stuff. So we want you to sit out there. And we still think that even though those are some smaller dimensions, there's still furniture that can fit out there, and it's still reasonable space to use.
Which I think ADA turnaround is what, 6 inches?
Yeah, it would be 5 feet, but it's,
I guess my comment on the ADA turnaround is these houses are all 5 feet up out of the ground.
Yeah.
So you're already not in an ADA situation.
Same, the radius.
Yeah.
yeah, well, yeah. So that would be a situation where someone would claim a hardship and would probably be granted their request. They'd be asking for a ramp or, there are
Most
plenty
properties
of,
are typically 5 feet wide.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
okay. Yeah, I had another point or question, and it's totally slipped my mind.
I think
Okay.
as far as the city's recommendation on making a difference between open and closed porches,
Yeah.
I think we can both get behind that conceptually as well, because I think that's actually a really good thing, is to make that determination, that you get the bonus for keeping your front porch open and for being a good neighbor and all that sort of stuff. So I think that makes
Yeah.
a ton of sense. I'd love to clarify it if it wasn't just 50% was open to make it an open
Yeah,
porch.
yeah.
It seems like a greater percentage should be considered open to make it an open porch.
Yeah, I think, open,
Because I think 50% is pretty egregious.
You close the bottom part, in essence, you create
Yes. And now it's 4 windows away from being an enclosed porch. So, yeah.
Yeah, and well, I think we're going to all assume that the enclosed porch is not providing the benefit or the contact. It's now, again, an interior space. And so, yeah, so on that subject, are there any thoughts on how to define because this was actually something that I had talked about with staff about the definition between an interior and enclosed porch and an open porch, and that it seemed that it's not a porch. As soon as you get to a certain point, it becomes a room. So are there any thoughts on the definition if we're going to propose modifying, the language, the definition of what would constitute
From
it?
my perspective, staff started out at a good point. From the I would just like to see open as greater than 50% open. It needs to be more than 50% open.
What is the staff justification for the 50%?
I'd say there's not a particular magic in the number. A porch is going to have to, and the architects get into this better, but have to have some sort of railing. 42 inches, is that?
No, 36 and
36 inches, okay. Yep, thanks. So it's going to have some level of enclosure.
But again, if we're
Right.
trying to make sure that it's open, that railing should be 50% open, but you're saying 50% open of the whole thing, which means they could theoretically build a knee wall up to 36 inches, have it be 7 feet tall, and then you're meeting that. And I don't think that's the spirit of an open porch, is to have a 36-inch knee wall, right, like this, right? Me sitting behind this isn't the same as me being behind open balusters.
Yeah. I guess I'm more concerned about the other definition, which is the enclosed porch, where it becomes, it seems to be, it loses definition as a porch at a certain at 100% enclosure. So,
Well, it doesn't, because the way that they're currently treated is that if it's not livable space in terms of heating, openness into the rest of the house, that sort of stuff, it is still treated as a porch. They become very hard to tell when they make that transition is the problem.
yeah, if they open
The one house on Chart C, that 2404 Grant, again, I'm not picking on 2404 Grant, I just want to make that clear. You see how there's two windows in the front that separate the living room from the sun porch. Be very easy to take those two windows out, and all of a sudden you have a change, but you wouldn't be able to see that from the front of the house.
And I think that staff is saying an enclosed porch could be a 3-season room. And a 3-season room can have windows and doors. It just doesn't have heat. And so we just don't know when it has heat and when it doesn't. There's not a light on the outside of the house. It
yeah.
has heat on.
but is it defined as not, a porch as not having,
I think that's probably an interpretation. It's not in the definition of porch right now. There is some more detail in the definitions or the criteria to get the 50% exemption from lot area there. But that is a good suggestion that
can we
potentially
say
that could be in the
unconditioned
enclosed.
space, or include some kind of language for unconditioned space, or?
To include that in the enclosed porch definition.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
I
could
think
go
that's
so
a
far
good
as to say
suggestion.
unconditioned space that's not open to main living space. You could add that as well.
I think you're certain.
That's a little,
Because
yep.
there's something nice about having a porch that
Yeah.
has French doors behind it, opens
Yes.
up into
Yep.
this beautiful screen that everyone can walk on. I
Absolutely.
want to discourage people from doing that.
Yeah.
And I'm a little bit disturbed, or I'm uncomfortable that we're trying to prevent a problem that doesn't seem to be a problem.
It becomes a problem, because in my years on the ZBA, we had at least 3 cases that I can think of off the top of my head, and I've not done research, where we had people either wanting to add a second story on top of what used to be a porch. It was an enclosed porch that became livable space, and then their argument was, we just want to add a second story above.
That's a different issue, though. Then they have to put in a new foundation. These are a lot
No,
of
they don't have to put in a new foundation if they're building on top of an existing first-floor structure that's an enclosed porch that has
if the existing porch actually has a foundation, which not many do.
in Evanston, I've seen at least.
The ones do. The one in your photograph here, a friend of mine lived at 1807 Asbury. It's been that way since,
Right.
I don't want to tell you my age, but a very long time,
Right.
several decades.
Right.
And that doesn't have a foundation.
No, but we've seen brick, particularly brick homes that do have that.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you do. But
I think your point is well made, though, about having that pair of French doors that open up to a screen porch. I think
Yeah.
that is a really nice thing.
it is,
So
and sometimes I don't think the wainscot or the
knee wall.
the knee wall,
Yeah.
I don't think there's merit over one design over another. It depends on the character of the house. So we're starting to kind of, I think we should, I'm not comfortable in voting on any of this tonight because it opens up a whole different game. I think there is an important, I think it is important to define what a porch is, and I think the existing definition is pretty weak and vague. I think it has to be defined further as an unheated open space. I think there should be a definition or some exemption for openness. I think that's a very good rule. But again, if people want to have this 3-season room, we shouldn't discourage them from doing that or
And
penalize
you're
them.
saying conditioning the space is preventing them from doing that?
I think not, by not conditioning, by not having heating and cooling within that enclosed area, that would clearly be, in my view, not being a porch anymore. Right?
Okay, yeah, okay, so
So
we're
I
not
think we're in
disagreeing,
agreement on
we're
that.
not disagreeing on the conditioning portion, it's
No.
just the transparency between the proper enclosed space and the porch space. That's
Correct,
part of it,
yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
And,
So-
and I can totally
Yeah.
agree with that. I see your point.
Okay.
It's an excellent point. So that makes total sense. I guess my fear, just again, is if we only limit it to, if we don't make a difference between an enclosed porch and an open porch, we're going to continue to see that these open porches eventually get enclosed because it's a way to make your house bigger. It's a way to make it grow with you. And it's a way that those things can happen. And I think one of our goals as all planners here, right, is to keep our streets friendly and open and to keep eyes on the street and all that sort of stuff. And then not to have so much overdevelopment. My goal.
So is there any other discussion? Any other questions? So playing on your point, Commissioner Pagozzi, is there is a fifth option available to us, which is to refer this, and I hate to say this, refer this to the zoning committee of the Plan Commission for further discussion to develop whatever definition besides the four options outlined earlier. So just to put it out there. Is there any further discussion?
I would also like to have the definition of an open versus a closed porch tightened or
Did-
further defined. I'm not sure I understand what an open porch is.
So yeah, go ahead.
Just to follow up on that, the definition that includes in the memo, which again would be a new definition, so something we're coming up with and certainly can be revised. Porch open, an open unroofed or roofed area that features openings with a maximum opacity of 50%. attached to building located between the exterior wall of the building and the right-of-way, as opposed to enclosed porch, roofed area that features walls and/or windows that exceed 50% opacity attached to the building located between the exterior wall of the building and the right-of-way. So that's the first stab at it.
But weren't they just saying that 50% could be misinterpreted some way? Or shouldn't it be less than 50% to be an open porch?
More than.
Well, all right. And then, of course, there's the definition about whether we add qualifications to make it unheated or untreated conditioned space. So do you, excuse me?
It's not in there regarding conditions?
I don't think it was in your definition.
It's not in the current definition and not in the proposed.
It has been kind of standard operating practice for the zoning board, but it has not been truly a condition, or not condition, but an existing written.
Yeah, but I think it would be good to codify it.
Yes.
Yeah, so.
Yes.
What screens
So-
would that fall under?
Screens would be open.
Screens would be open.
Yes.
Yeah, we want people to
But,
have a
yeah,
screen
yeah,
porch,
bugs-
'cause it's
bugs
exactly-
are-
It's exactly the point Mr. Bergozzi was making, right? Is
Yeah.
if you can open your front doors to your living room and get the screen porch air to come in, now you don't need the air conditioning, and it's all good. It's
quite nice.
It's a delightful way to live, and so if you have a space that lets you do that, I think that's very nice.
Yeah. So my opinion that 50% open is not I mean, it can always be more than that. It's not a high bar to cross. And, I mean, the problem is, is it too little to make it open? And I don't know. I mean, are we going to prove that are we going to be able to, are we going to be able to prove that by referring this to committee? And, I mean, I don't know how we're.
I don't
going
think
to-
it's something that
Yeah.
you can, that
Yeah.
is provable. Like I said, all these
Yeah,
these become
exactly.
very, very difficult to determine
Right.
when this stuff happens.
Yeah.
Because you may not notice a change to the exterior of the house
Mm-hmm.
when it does happen.
Also,
I think you'd notice.
does this separate between front porches and back porches?
Back porches are not being considered here at all. So any decks, back porches, anything like that still would fall under existing ordinances.
Because they're not an encroachment into a front yard, so
Yeah.
it's a whole different set of rules.
Just a little bit of information on the percentage, taking a look at a American Planning Association publication that has definitions from various municipalities. 50 and 75 are the two numbers that I'm seeing in these definitions.
So what is a case for 75, which is the.
So Coral Gables, Florida, very much like
Little
Evanston
different environment.
in climate. maybe soon enough it will be, but a roof structure not more than 75% enclosed by walls and attached to the main building for the purpose of sheltering from the rays of the sun and from the rain and weather, exclusive of vehicles, either persons or inanimate objects.
Okay. So your yard gnome can be protected by. That's right. Okay. All right. Is it too soon to ask if anyone can form a motion or has an opinion one way or another? So again, to summarize, I think we could recommend to keep our previous recommendation. We could recommend to adapt the language that has been proposed by the ZBA chairs as it's put forth here. I think as part of that, we could add the stipulation of a definition of open and enclosed porches that staff is recommending. It could go to either, or we could do something else.
Okay, I'll just get this ball rolling. I'll make a motion that we accept the ZBA Chair's recommendation along with the amendment prepared by staff about open versus closed porches.
And are we adding the language about treated versus unconditioned space to the definition?
Definitely, yes, definitely.
Anyone second that?
I second that.
Okay. So I think we have to take a vote. So let's do it as a roll call.
Commissioner Commissioner Brown,
Aye.
Commissioner Dubin,
No.
Commissioner Goddard,
Aye.
Commissioner Pagotzi,
No.
and Chair Lewis.
Aye.
3-2.
So,
So
I
the motion passes.
think the motion passes. Is
Yeah.
that?
It's different from
Yes.
CBA.
Yes. Yes, it's simple majority of the, so it's simple majority of the quorum, not of the board, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so.
We're
we would-
determining lots of times we have to
we-
meet 4 on everything.
Right, exactly. So, yeah, so I believe it passes under our rules, so.
Thank you so
Okay.
much for your time.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And-
Very interesting issue, and thank you for your deep thought about it and sharing your experience, so.
Yeah, thanks for
right.
everyone's
Thank you.
time and extra
Yeah,
time,
right,
even outside of
exactly. Yeah,
meetings,
definitely,
regular meetings.
definitely. Well presented.
Let's talk about historic preservation now.
Okay, all right, thank you. All right, so we get to talk about historic preservation.
Yes, if I can get that.
Thank you.
Okay, the second item on the agenda this evening is dealing with our preservation procedures, the review procedures. And as a bit of background, just last month on May 14th, City Council actually approved an amendment to Title II, Chapter 8, which addresses historic preservation. And the ordinance for that amendment updated the language and definitions and streamlined the procedures to try to make them a bit more user-friendly for staff, the public, and the commission itself. And as a point of reference, the zoning code, which is actually Title VI, references the original 1975 ordinance, more specifically 23-0-75, instead of the most recently updated regulations in Title II. So within the zoning code, there are, as I mentioned before, various sections which reference that original ordinance, as well as requirements for full preservation commission review. One of the main examples of this would be in section 6-15-11-5, which is the relationship to special uses and variations. Basically, this particular section says that if there's an application that is submitted for a special use or any type of variation that affects a landmark or property that's located within a historic district, that application has to be referred to the Preservation Commission for them to review and make a recommendation to the appropriate decision-making body. So they do their particular review, and this happens regardless of whether or not that application is for minor work or major work with regards to Preservation Commission. And going back to the May 14th meeting, when there was discussion on this particular topic, a point was brought up that the process to get approval for these projects can take a lot longer due to the fact that even for a minor work that does need a certificate of appropriateness from preservation, ends up taking a lot longer due to the requirements that go to the Preservation Commission. So there was an aldermanic request to revise the code to make sure, or to attempt to streamline that process and make it a little bit shorter and not have the requirement to go to Preservation Commission for minor work. So that being considered, staff is proposing the following amendments. We would go through more so in cleaning up the language where we reference the original 1975 ordinance. So change it from Ordinance 23075 or Appendix C, which addresses some of the items within that ordinance, and change that to Title II, Chapter 8. That would affect Code Sections 615.11.1, 615.11.2, 615.11.6, and 618.3. Also, we would go to a couple of additional sections that specifically reference the need to have a full Preservation Commission review. The next section being 6467, which is special regulations applicable to fences. This particular section is actually pretty extensive with regards to zoning requirements for fences, but there is a portion within that section that relates specifically to historic fences. So we would be updating that, striking the need to have Preservation Commission review. There would still be some review that occurs. It would just be done administratively by staff, or in cases where it is a major work, or say an addition or something along those lines, there would still be Preservation Commission review. So this would simply just make it not a requirement for every single case that pops up. And the other amendments that is proposed within here would be to Section 615.11.5, which I briefly mentioned earlier. We would be changing the language within this section so that it includes special uses, minor variations, family necessity variations, and major variations as they relate to historic landmarks. But we would be excluding the need to have Preservation Commission review for projects where the Preservation Commission delegates the responsibility of review and approval and gives that authority to staff. So in this case, you wouldn't necessarily have to go to Preservation Commission for every single case that pops up, be it specifically addressing the minor work that pops up or the routine work that pops up. So for this particular text amendment, we do also have the same standards for amendments, whether the proposed amendment is consistent with the goals, objectives, and policies of the Comprehensive General Plan as adopted and amended from time to time by City Council, whether the proposed amendment is compatible with the overall character of existing development in the immediate vicinity of the subject property, whether the proposed amendment will have an adverse effect on the value of adjacent properties, and adequacy of public facilities and services. Several of these do not actually apply, given it's very broad and does not deal with a very specific property. So we can revisit those during deliberation.
So is that the end of your presentation?
That is the end.
Okay. So again, I'll open it up to questions from,
I have two questions. I have two. The first is, when staff is making the decision, right, when it goes to being sort of an administrative resolution, how do you know or guarantee, I'm not sure guarantee is the right word, but that the administrator's decision is generally what the decision of the board would be? Just that would be my first concern, because my sense is that they are not necessarily the same. And I don't know which administrator necessarily is the one, because you're not specifying who the administrator is, whether it's the preservation coordinator or it's head of community development or it's zoning and planning. So that's the first question. The second thing is, Okay, put my zoning board chair hat back on. Occasionally, when we get a building that's gone to preservation, homeowners are under the impression that once they've gone through preservation, they are essentially guaranteed their zoning variance. When in fact, the Preservation Commission doesn't have to evaluate the variance by the 7 standards. And the 7 standards are rigorous, and so we like to be rigorous with those. And so what we would like to see is that you come to ZBA first, get your zoning variance, and then go make it look how preservation would like you to have it look. Because there are cases wherein we would not allow that variance, but preservation will. And so it gets a little muddy when preservation says yes. So that's all I got to say. Thank you. Are there questions about what I've said?
I should have said, get to your question.
Oh, I asked the
that's
first question. It was the first was a question, and then the second was a please, will you consider
Yes, exactly.
having it go to
That's-
ZBA before
that's-
going
that's
to
fine, yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the public? Okay. Questions from commissioners? Do you have your mic on, by the way? Okay, thank you.
I mean, in a nutshell, we're
This is what's
giving
proposed.
staff the authority to rule about fences regarding landmarks issues.
That's one portion of it.
One portion of it.
Yes.
Okay.
And that portion within the zoning ordinance language is the most clear cut because a fence variation is a specified type of variation within the zoning ordinance. So that can be referenced within that same document as fence variations not being referred to the Preservation Commission. And again, the reason for that is that within the Preservation Commission's rules, there's both the preservation ordinance and then the ordinance allows the commission to make rules that determines and delegates whether there's staff review or commission review of different projects. And so within the commission's current rules, fences are a staff level review as opposed to commission level review.
Okay. I don't see where we're defining where that threshold is. Or am I not?
Yeah, so it's one of the challenges that we have sort of 3 different documents here, the zoning ordinance, the preservation ordinance, and then the rules of the Preservation Commission. So this text is referring that where certificates of appropriateness are required or allowed to be issued by staff through the Preservation Ordinance and their rules and procedures, so still allowing that authority to the Preservation Commission to determine what the level of review is, either staff or commission review. But where staff is allowed to review, in that case, the Preservation Commission would not need to make a recommendation on the variance because it's a type of work. One example would be a patio, for example, that staff has the authority to grant certificate of appropriateness for a patio. However, if increasing that patio size, puts it at 31% instead of 30% building lot coverage, or I guess it'd be 46 instead of 45 impervious coverage. Under the current rules, because it would be any type of variance, then that would go to the Preservation Commission. Whereas in the proposed amendment, because the preservation rules allow staff to make that decision on the certificate of appropriateness, the variance would not go to their commission. And it just as a little more background information, the Preservation Commission met last night. While they're not a recommending body to the Plan Commission on text amendments, we did include this same staff report within their packet and had it as a discussion item. And there was no discussion on the item, so there was no opposition to these changes.
But not support.
There was no discussion either way, so they didn't take a vote. It wasn't an actionable item.
Because that was my question, whether this was being supported by the Historic Preservation
good.
Commission. Yeah.
Good to know. So is this limited to, aren't there a couple levels of landmark status? There's an historic district, and then there's a building that's actually landmarked, a specific structure that's landmarked.
Correct.
Are all
Within
structures that are in a district landmarked?
No, but they're all subject, either within a district or a landmark, are all subject to the preservation ordinance, subject to the need for a certificate of appropriateness.
Okay. Would this apply to any structure with a landmark status, whether it's a specific structure or in an historic district?
Correct. So it'd be,
So this is across the board.
yeah, so everything within a district as well as the landmark or not, and in addition to landmarks that are outside of districts. That's somewhere around 2,500 properties in the city.
All right, thanks. Those are my questions.
So getting to
Can I ask a
Chair.
question? Just out of curiosity, does this apply to windows? You know how windows are an issue in historic districts? Do windows now get approved by staff versus by plan commission? Or not plan commission, sorry, preservation.
Windows can be approved by staff if they meet the standards and the materials. They can also be referred to the Preservation Commission if there are changes in materials that are not consistent.
Okay.
Right. So that gets to what is the definition between minor work and major work, and what is generally the jurisdiction of staff within that district or property.
Yes, and so the Preservation Commission rules, which are included in your packet, page 87 of the packet is probably the place to start. Has a very substantial matrix with 59 different items, types of work, and then whether that is considered routine maintenance, it doesn't need any review, whether it requires staff review or requires commission review. So that is what the Preservation Commission has, and actually last night they adopted these revisions to their rules as well.
Okay.
Do we have any sense of how many of the proposed variations are minor and how many are major? And the reason I'm asking this is because Evanston gets a bad rap for making it very difficult for builders or homeowners to do anything. So I'm wondering if this would really speed things up for them.
It's a good question, Commissioner Goddard. Unfortunately, don't have that research in front of us as far as how many items have gone to the Preservation Commission that otherwise would not if there weren't being a variance requested. I'd say, at the most, it's maybe one or two per meeting for them, and they meet on a monthly basis. But unfortunately, don't have that.
Can I interject anecdotally? So people want to replace their windows on their houses. They want to upgrade them. They want to put in energy efficient windows. In historic districts, they are generally not doing it because of the high hurdle of going through preservation. So I think this would be a huge benefit to the homeowners in Evanston of bringing their houses up to reasonable energy standards by allowing them to replace their windows in a more timely manner. So that's anecdotally.
Mm-hmm.
And referring to those preservation rules and that the matrix on page 90 of your packet, looks like items 48 through 54 deal with windows and door replacements of various types and whether there's a change in appearance or not. And so some of those can be approved by staff. However, where there's alteration, removal, replacement of existing windows and doors, or additions of new windows and doors, when there's a change of design, materials, or general appearance, in that case, it requires a commission review.
Right. So in general, you're saying it's an administrative decision if it's like for like or similar in appearance, even if it's an upgraded, thermally efficient, so long as it's a, 2x6 paned, matching to a 2x6 paned existing that would be administrative, and if it's some different aesthetic, then you would kick it to the commission for review. Is that generally the procedure?
That is one avenue, although restoring windows and keeping original windows, I think, is always the first preference. And I think it depends on the condition of the windows to some extent, and then what is being proposed, and whether that if there's a difference in the design and exterior appearance of those.
Please.
I think one of the benefits to approaching it this way also is allows preservation in the city to not necessarily paint all homes in a district with the exact same brush. There are many homes in historic districts that are not landmark status properties, that are not specifically significant in any way, shape, or form, and to make them subject to the exact same rules as a Howard Van Doren Shaw home or something along those lines. It allows the Preservation Commission to focus on those places that are of significance, and I don't want to say bypass, but staff can deal administratively with the homes that are of lesser significance or of no significance. There are homes that were built in the 1950s or 60s that exist in our historic districts, and to make them go through the same process as a significant building seems a little unfair to those owners, in my opinion.
So I'm unclear on how what is being proposed under the third portion about minor and major variations, how that's affecting, for instance, this matrix that the matrix is not part of the code, right? It's part of the
That's correct. That's
chapter 6.
Yeah, that's correct. That's good point, Chair Lewis. Tonight's action and the Plan Commission does not have any authority to make any changes to the Preservation Commission, either ordinance or rules, so it would not make any of those changes. It's just changing areas where there are variances or special uses, which are under the zoning ordinance, and there's some sort of preservation approval. It would change those for the ones where the preservation approval can be done by staff.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So our jurisdiction is just with Chapter 6 of the ordinance.
Title 6, yes.
Title 6 of the ordinance. I'm sorry. All right. And then can I ask, just not that it's defined there, but what is the standard process or order of approvals if someone is asking for a zoning variation or a planning variation in a district with historic character, and where is that defined?
It would be in this code section in front of us that the Preservation Commission shall make its recommendation to the zoning decision-making body, so either to the zoning administrator or to the Zoning Board of Appeals. So by their recommendation needing to be made, they're first in the process in making that recommendation.
So the current ZBA's chair's point about the sequence of events is contradicted here and would have to be, okay.
It is, and it's a bit of a, depends on the circumstance.
Yeah,
Sometimes it could go either way. I very well see the point there.
Okay.
Colby, I had one question and one comment. Is the chart that starts on page 87
The chart.
the routine maintenance, minor work, major work? The date says December 1st, 2017. Is this being proposed? How different is this from what was there before?
So the Preservation Commission went through about a 1.5-year process of reviewing the ordinance itself and then their rules. The ordinance changes were made or under the authority of the City Council, and those were adopted on May 14th. And then just last night, the Preservation Commission adopted their rules with some modifications to their rules, so that the ones that are presented as draft in your packet as of last night are now the rules in effect.
Yeah. I just had one comment, and this is having worked on a landmark for the last 4 years. I think there's a big difference between structures in an historic district, and there are all kinds of reasons why a district is historic, as opposed to if you have a specific building that's designated as an Evanston landmark. I think there should be a different criteria for each one of those, because I do think it's important to have an extra level of scrutiny and review if we're gonna make the effort to name a landmark. I think it is important to review those specific details on how something is renovated or modified or, quote unquote, improved. Because I see this as it might be minor, big deal, you replace the window, but it is an erosion of what we're there to preserve in the intent.
Well, the one point is I don't think it's our jurisdiction, but
I don't.
But the other,
It's a
but the
comment.
other point
It's a
is
comment.
I would have to agree that you shouldn't be able to repair on a Howard Van Doren Shaw house. You take Menards aluminum downspouts and put them on it. But I
in
think
this,
that's saying that staff doesn't have the ability to recognize that. So there has to be some authority and faith in the judgment of the staff to. I mean, they can always take their authority and bump it up. I think was part of the point, is saying that if you're proposing this, I think it has to go before right? Is that the case?
Yes, in their rules, it is listed minor work, generally reviewed by the Community Development Department staff, but staff will refer minor work projects to the commission for review if in staff judgment the change involves alteration, additions, or removals are substantial, do not meet the standards, or precedent-setting nature.
Yeah.
Well, I've had different experiences and seeing how different pressures get applied to different governing bodies. And it's the Landmarks Commission is there to protect the landmark and the specific features that made it a landmark. And if that is eroded away to any degree, I think it's a step in the wrong direction. Just my opinion.
Okay.
If I could just comment, I'd like to say I generally agree with you. However, I worked on a project last year where the house was a landmark. You wouldn't have known it because it was covered in vinyl siding. So it became as a surprise when we submitted for permit. And it turns out that the house was, long story short, was remarkable for being unremarkable. It was a typical worker's cottage of the day, in the simplified Queen Anne style of the day. And that, to me, is not, again, in the same vein, that is not the same level of landmark as a Frank Lloyd Wright, a Howard Van Doren Shaw, who's the Talmadge and whoever that other guy is, that person. So I think that there should be some latitude, even in a landmark status, of some ability to.
We can debate about landmark status.
Yeah.
I mean, the first thing about landmark status is that you don't put a value judgment on your personal experiences on what you think is appropriate or not. If a structure is designated as a landmark for a valid reason and it's voted on by a democratic body, then it's a landmark. And no administrator gets to waive with prejudice saying, hey, I don't think that's really worth it. And that's the whole intent of having that protection, so we don't lose things that are valuable.
Okay. I'm going to try to get us
Great.
back on
Yep,
track
thank you.
because I think this is not part of our task before us. So our task before us is to address the three issues brought up before us, which I believe was cleaning up the language, was instead of referencing the 1975 historic ordinance, referring to Title II, the current historic preservation ordinance. Number two is the authority for staff to to approve fences on historic properties. Is that basically it? And three, I'm not quite sure on what we're what we're approving. It's the authority to,
It has to do with the authority to make, for the Preservation Commission to make recommendations on variances and special uses to exclude items where the commission, through its rules and ordinance, have authorized staff to make the decision for certificates of appropriateness.
say that again. So it's saying that the
Currently, all variances and special uses are referred to the Preservation Commission for recommendation. This change would exclude items where the Preservation Commission, through its ordinance and rules, have delegated staff the authority to issue certificates of appropriateness.
So this is basically referring to your matrix or the authority granted therein and allowing us to say that that's fine.
Yes, so it would allow the zoning decision-making body, whether that's the zoning administrator or the zoning board of appeals, to make those decisions without recommendation of the Preservation Commission.
I may short-circuit all of this for you.
Okay.
I think that one of the issues that the current chair raised was something that we should look at, and so, and that is, what is the process for when the zoning decision is made versus when the historic preservation decision is made. I think that's a very important decision, and so I would ask that this actually be held until the next meeting so that there can be some discussion with staff over that.
Held for the next.
Well, I'm not sure
Well,
this
yeah.
precludes us. His suggestion precludes us from making a decision on what's before us tonight.
Well, that would be excluding the language that is proposed or revising the language of the revisions to 6:15-11:5. So, which makes it a little difficult. So I mean, we have the ability to refer this to the committee, the zoning committee, for discussion, to have a little more open discussion about how the order goes, and could provide a whole recommendation, as opposed to, I think Commissioner Goddard was saying we can knock off 1 and 2 fairly clearly, but the third aspect has some discussion that has to happen. So.
Yeah, in my mind, that would be a more major change that the Preservation Commission then would not be making any recommendations on zoning matters.
Thank you.
So, I think it's different than what's the referral was from City Council.
Yeah, I'm glad you clarified that, because I don't think landmarks, the commission should be in any way, shape, or form approving something that is a zoning matter. I don't know how that happens.
We're not asking them to.
Okay.
That's not the issue. The issue is that they'll grant approval for something that is actually not something that's approved, that will get approved by the zoning.
So for
Or variance by the zoning. So they say, I don't know what it is, you can.
For example, we've used the patio example that goes over on impervious surface. So 45% is what's permitted. Someone goes to 47%. They go to preservation. Preservation says that's okay to go to 47%.
But it would still have to be contingent. They could approve it in the lens of a landmark issue, but it would still be contingent on getting zoning approval.
Right.
That's the-
But there's not always that understanding from people.
From what people?
By people who are doing the application. So I come before preservation and I ask for a variance, because variance is one of the things that I'm asked to address before preservation, because I'm being kicked to preservation through the ordinance as it's currently written.
Okay.
So one of the things they vote on is a variance approval. But that variance approval is separate from the zoning board approval. They aren't looking at what are the standards for granting additional impervious surface.
Okay.
And to clarify, they're making a recommendation on the
They're
variance.
making-
They're
yeah.
not the
Okay.
determining
So
body.
it-
So you think the public is being confused by
People
having these
come to the
various
zoning
governing
board and want
bodies?
to know why, if the zoning board were to deny them, well, I was approved for preservation on this.
So, yeah.
Okay, well,
Just to get to your point, you said that the commission, the historic commission, is not a determining body, it's a recommending body, and the final say is with city council or with the zoning board of appeals?
For a zoning matter, the items that are in our text amendment, a special use or a fence variation, a minor variation, all those items, either the zoning administrator or the zoning board of appeals, a determining body, or in some cases, for certain variations, parking and height and townhouse orientation, or city council. So they're not determining, they're making a recommendation on those variances.
They are only a determining body on historic
To issue certificates of appropriateness
certificates of appropriateness.
and landmark status. But,
All right. So if the only issue is really clarification of applicants' expectations, I don't know if it's a issue worth modifying the authority of the body. But
I would ask that it be held. That's my request still for a month. Obviously, this board can do as they choose, but that would be my request, so that issue can be discussed a little further with staff.
And, okay, so, and who's going to discuss it?
Anybody who wants to discuss
it? Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's the reason why I wanted to put it at the committee, is so the discussion was formalized. But, all right,
So this was never discussed before?
the order of the,
Yeah, I guess that's my
Yeah.
question. Has this been discussed before?
It's been an ongoing issue. It's never been discussed before.
I think they skipped that stuff.
Is it possible that it could be reversed, that the the ZBA could approve a project, then it goes to the preservation?
That's
And
entirely-
they say
that's
it's not
entirely possible.
historically preserved.
That's
So
entirely
we're-
possible as well.
Yeah, so.
But usually when historic preservation is dealing with issues, they're not dealing with the same type of land use issues. They're dealing with appropriateness of whatever is being
Right.
built, added on.
Right.
And so that is a more fungible item than is the zoning ordinance. The zoning ordinance is unique in that, I mean, preservation is able to adapt their rules, just like zoning cannot change the rules under which it operates.
If I can give you a more tangible example, I happened to be sitting at a preservation meeting, and a gentleman was making an application, and nobody on preservation, they kind of didn't like where his design was going, and they didn't know what zoning would approve. And so, off the record, I said, this is what we typically will allow. We will allow you to put a second floor over an existing first floor. And that changed everything, because now preservation could get the look they were going for rather than trying to solve some other issue the other way. So if he had come to zoning first, right, we would have given him the parameters that, sure, you can put a second floor on top of this rather than having to offset 2 feet and then trying to solve that from a preservation perspective. So it would have streamlined it for the client, for the homeowner, certainly, and cut down on time for preservation. So,
well, it seems to make sense to me to get the absolutes out of the way, or the more
right, because what we talk about is
less
sort of a box.
discretionary decisions out of
Right.
the way, and then you can do whatever you want to do within the
box.
But
Yeah.
that's my shoot from the hip, impression. So I think it's probably time that someone make a motion. So I think we have, I don't know, we can somehow accommodate the
Kobe,
request,
can I ask
go
one
ahead.
more
Yeah,
question?
please.
Does staff feel is staff confident that they have the personnel in place to make these decisions and understand when things are at a staff level and should go to the committee level? Are they comfortable with that?
I mean, that's how we've been operating with the Preservation Commission's rules.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
So more specifically, is there anyone with historic preservation training at an administrative level, a staff administrator, historic?
We do. Staff works on different levels on projects. A broader range of staff work on more minor projects and fences and roofs and things that can be approved. And then currently a smaller set of staff works on projects that are more detailed.
Yeah, so, okay.
Specifically, the preservation coordinator has the most specific expertise when it comes to architectural details and things of that nature.
So there is some expertise in place, is what I was trying to get
Right.
to. It's not just, like I'm an architect who happens to have a brother-in-law who does this, does exactly historic preservation, and I would say I'm totally unqualified. I mean, I can point out a Queen Anne style house, I can do, but I'm totally unqualified, so, anyway. So, is there some thought about forming a place to go here?
Well, I'm going to make a motion that we accept the 3 recommendations from staff.
Is there a second? I think we should have a roll call vote.
Okay. Commissioner Brown,
No. Postpone.
Commissioner Dubin,
Yes.
Commissioner Goddard,
Aye.
Commissioner Pagotzi, and Chair Lewis.
No.
That's 3-2, so it's a majority to adopt as presented.
Yeah, this would be a recommendation to City Council.
Yep, so that's our recommendation to the City Council to adopt the recommendation of staff. All right.
Thanks for your time.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your input. Right.
They still have an opportunity to address their concerns.
To the,
Planning and development.
yeah, right. Yep, yeah,
I think
so,
that's probably a better place.
Right, yeah.
yeah.
So, you're on the zoning board of appeals. Yes.
I am not any longer.
You're not just an enthusiast.
It's a former
So I spent 10,
Chair.
10 years on the zoning board of appeals, and I've made it my mission lately to try to figure out how to simplify some of our zoning stupidities that we go through. And so that's what I intend to try to work on.
Good for you.
Just
Yep. Thank you for,
over what we've experienced over the years.
This was very helpful.
yeah. Mary Beth, Matt, thank you very much for everything. Yep. Okay, so I'm opening up the floor for public comment. I think you just had that. There is no more public comment. So is there a motion to adjourn? Second? Second. Mr. Brown. All right, all in favor? Aye. Aye. All opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you.